In the sterile corridors of the Pentagon, where power echoes through marble halls and decisions shape the fate of nations, Admiral Richard Blackwood had built his reputation on iron discipline and unwavering authority. For 35 years, he had commanded respect through fear, his voice capable of reducing seasoned officers to trembling cadets. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as he raised his hand against what he believed to be an insubordinate young woman, he had no idea he was about to strike someone whose classified kill count exceeded that of entire military units. The woman standing before him, dressed in civilian clothes with dirt under her fingernails and defiance in her steel-grey eyes, carried secrets that could topple governments. She had infiltrated terrorist cells in Syria, eliminated high-value targets in Afghanistan, and survived missions that existed only in the darkest corners of military archives. Yet here she stood, about to be struck by a man who saw nothing more than a disrespectful girl who had dared to challenge his authority. What Admiral Blackwood didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ghost Mitchell had been declared dead 3 years ago. What he couldn't have imagined was that the woman he was about to hit had just returned from a mission so classified that only 5 people in the entire world knew she was still alive. And what would haunt him for the rest of his career was that his moment of rage was about to expose the military's most carefully guarded secret, that their most lethal weapon had been hiding in plain sight all along. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Pentagon's east wing as Sarah Mitchell walked purposefully down the polished corridor. Her civilian clothes, faded jeans, worn boots, and a simple black jacket stood out starkly against the sea of pressed uniforms that parted before her. She had been walking these halls for 20 minutes, following the detailed instructions that had been whispered to her in a safe house in Romania just 48 hours earlier. 3 years. 3 years since the world had been told that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell died in a helicopter crash over the Arabian Sea. 3 years since her own family had mourned her at a funeral with an empty casket. 3 years since she had become a ghost, operating in the shadows of international conflicts that officially never happened. But now she was back, and she needed to reach Admiral Harrison before anyone else discovered she was alive. The Pentagon's morning rush was in full swing. Officers hurried between meetings, their footsteps echoing off marble floors, while the quiet hum of the world's most powerful military machine continued its daily operations. Sarah kept her head down, her trained eyes constantly scanning for threats, exits, and surveillance cameras. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive through missions that would have broken lesser soldiers. She was 3 corridors away from Admiral Harrison's office when she took a wrong turn. The mistake was minor, a left instead of a right at the junction near the Joint Chiefs Conference Room, but it led her directly into the path of Admiral Richard Blackwood. At 58, Blackwood was a man who commanded attention without asking for it. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his uniform immaculate, and his ice-blue eyes held the kind of cold authority that had been forged through decades of unquestioned power. Blackwood was in the middle of a heated conversation with his aide, Colonel Stevens, about budget allocations, when he noticed the young woman walking past them with what he perceived as deliberate disregard for military protocol. "Excuse me," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge that had made junior officers tremble for 3 decades. "You there?" Sarah stopped but didn't immediately turn around. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to avoid any confrontation that might compromise her mission. She had spent 3 years learning to blend into crowds, to become invisible, to slip through the cracks of society without leaving a trace. But the voice behind her carried the unmistakable tone of military authority, and some responses were too deeply ingrained to ignore. She turned slowly, her grey eyes meeting Blackwood's with a steady gaze that immediately irritated him. Most people, especially civilians, showed some degree of nervousness when confronted by a high-ranking military officer in the halls of the Pentagon. This young woman looked at him with the kind of calm assessment usually reserved for equals. "Yes?" Sarah said simply, her voice carrying no deference, no acknowledgement of his rank or authority. Blackwood's jaw tightened. "Are you lost? Civilians aren't permitted in this section without an escort." "I'm not lost," Sarah replied, her tone remaining neutral. "I have business here." "Business?" Blackwood stepped closer. His full height, 6 feet 2 inches of military bearing, towering over Sarah's more modest 5 feet 6 inches. What kind of business could a civilian possibly have in a restricted area of the Pentagon? Colonel Stevens watched the exchange with growing unease. He had served under Blackwood for 6 years and knew the signs of his superior's mounting anger. The Admiral had a reputation for explosive confrontations, particularly with anyone he perceived as showing him disrespect. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. She could see the tension building in Blackwood's shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides, the slight flush rising in his cheeks. She recognized the type, a man drunk on his own authority, someone who had never been truly challenged and didn't know how to handle resistance. "That's classified," she said simply, turning to leave. The words hit Blackwood like a slap. In his world, he was the one who decided what was classified. He was the one who controlled information, who determined security levels, who decided who was authorized to know what. The casual dismissal from this young civilian woman was more than disrespectful. It was intolerable. "Stop right there," Blackwood commanded, his voice rising. "You don't get to walk away from me, and you certainly don't get to claim classification privileges in my Pentagon." Sarah paused, her back still to him. "Your Pentagon?" she asked, finally turning around. There was something different in her eyes now, a hardness that hadn't been there moments before. "I wasn't aware the United States military had become personal property." The corridor had grown quieter. Other officers had noticed the confrontation and were either stopping to watch or hurrying past with averted eyes. Colonel Stevens had gone pale, recognizing that his superior was about to cross a line that could have serious consequences. "How dare you?" Blackwood snarled, taking another step forward. "You insolent little brat, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "Admiral Richard Blackwood," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Graduated from Annapolis in 1989, third in your class. Served on the USS Hampton, then the USS Florida. Promoted to Admiral in 2018 after your tour in the Pacific Fleet. Currently oversees naval intelligence operations for the Joint Chiefs. Married to Patricia Blackwood for 22 years. 2 children, Michael and Jennifer. Your son Michael is currently a sophomore at Georgetown, studying international relations." The detailed recitation of his personal information hit Blackwood like cold water. His face went from red to white as he realized this was no ordinary civilian. But instead of stepping back, instead of reassessing the situation, his anger flared even higher. "How do you know that information?" he demanded. "It's my job to know," Sarah said quietly. "Your job?" Blackwood's voice had risen to a level that was attracting more attention. What job could a civilian possibly have that would require classified military intelligence? Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could walk away, complete her mission, and disappear back into the shadows. It would be the smart play, the safe play. But something in Blackwood's attitude, the casual arrogance, the assumption that his rank made him untouchable, reminded her of every corrupt official she had encountered in her 3 years operating in the gray areas between nations.
"The kind of job," she said slowly, "that people like you pretend doesn't exist."
Blackwood's face contorted with rage as he raised his hand, drawing it back in preparation for a slap that he believed would teach this insubordinate civilian a lesson about respect and authority. But as his hand moved through the air, Sarah's training took over. 3 years of survival in hostile territory, of hand-to-hand combat with terrorists and assassins, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity. Her hand shot up, catching Blackwood's wrist with a grip that immediately numbed his fingers. Her other hand moved to his elbow, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that would have dropped most men to their knees. But she held back, using only enough force to stop his attack while demonstrating exactly how outmatched he was. The corridor fell completely silent. Admiral Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in the United States Navy, stood frozen with his hand inches from Sarah's face, completely immobilized by a woman half his size. "Admiral," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a danger that made Colonel Stevens step backward, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action." Blackwood stared into her eyes and saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger or fear or even defiance. It was the kind of calm, professional assessment that predators gave their prey. In that moment, he realized he wasn't looking at an insubordinate civilian. He was looking at someone who had killed before, someone for whom violence was not an emotional response, but a calculated tool. "Who are you?" he whispered. Sarah held his gaze for another moment, then released his wrist. Blackwood stumbled backward, cradling his arm as feeling slowly returned to his fingers. "Someone you shouldn't have tried to hit," she said simply. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Admiral Blackwood standing in the corridor, surrounded by witnesses to his humiliation, with the growing realization that he had just made a terrible mistake. As Sarah disappeared around the corner, heading once again toward Admiral Harrison's office, Blackwood finally found his voice. "Find out who she is," he ordered Colonel Stevens, his voice hoarse with rage, and something that might have been fear. I want to know everything about that woman. Her name, her background, her security clearance, everything." Colonel Stevens nodded quickly and pulled out his phone, already dreading what they might discover. In his experience, civilians who could handle Admiral Blackwood with that level of ease were either extremely well connected or extremely dangerous. Often, they were both. Sarah continued down the corridor, her external calm masking the adrenaline surge from the confrontation. She had blown her cover, revealed skills that were supposed to remain hidden, and almost certainly triggered an investigation that would complicate her mission. But some things were more important than operational security. Some things were worth the risk. Behind her, Admiral Blackwood was already making calls, setting in motion a search that would lead him into the darkest corners of military intelligence. He had no idea that the woman he was hunting had been officially dead for 3 years. He couldn't have imagined that her real identity was buried under layers of classification so deep that most government officials didn't even know the programs existed. What he definitely didn't know was that in less than 24 hours he would discover exactly why Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell had been considered the Navy SEAL's most valuable asset, and why her apparent death had been considered one of the military's greatest losses. The hunt was about to begin, and Admiral Blackwood had no idea he was chasing a ghost. Admiral Harrison's office sat on the 4th floor of the Pentagon's E-Ring, its windows offering a view of the Potomac River that had comforted countless military leaders during moments of crisis. The office itself was a study in controlled power. American flags flanked a massive oak desk, while walls lined with commendations and photographs documented a career spanning 4 decades of service. Admiral James Harrison, at 63, was a man who had earned respect through competence rather than fear. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, his uniform pressed but not ostentatious, and his brown eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from making life-and-death decisions in situations where there were no good options. He was reviewing intelligence reports from the South China Sea when his aide knocked on the door. "Enter," Harrison called without looking up from the classified documents spread across his desk. "Admiral," the aide said carefully, "there's a woman here to see you. She says you're expecting her, but she's not on your schedule." Harrison's hand paused over the papers. Only 3 people in the world knew about his 11 o'clock appointment, and officially none of them existed. "Send her in," he said quietly, and closed the door behind her. Sarah Mitchell entered the office with the same purposeful stride that had carried her through hostile territory for 3 years. But here, in this sanctuary of legitimate authority, some of the tension left her shoulders. Admiral Harrison represented everything that was right about the military honor, duty, and the kind of moral clarity that had driven her to accept her impossible mission in the first place. "Admiral," she said simply, stopping 3 feet from his desk in a position that was somehow both respectful and alert. Harrison looked up from his papers and felt a surge of emotions he had spent 3 years suppressing. Relief, pride, and a deep sadness for what this young woman had sacrificed in service to her country. "Sarah," he said softly, using her real name for the first time in 3 years. "Welcome home." The words hit harder than she had expected. Home. For 3 years, home had been safe houses and borrowed identities, refugee camps and black site facilities, anywhere the mission required her to be. She had been Rachel Thompson in Syria, Maria Santos in Colombia, and dozens of other personas in dozens of other places. But here, in this office, she was simply Sarah Mitchell again. "Thank you, sir," she managed, surprised by the tightness in her throat. Harrison stood and walked around his desk, studying her face. The woman before him looked older than her 31 years, with lines around her eyes that spoke of constant vigilance and a wariness that had become second nature. Her dark hair was shorter now, cut in a practical style that could be quickly changed if necessary, and there were small scars on her hands that hadn't been there 3 years ago. "Sit down," he said gently, gesturing to one of the leather chairs that faced his desk. "You look like you could use some real coffee." Real coffee had been a luxury during her years in the field, where instant powder dissolved in lukewarm water was often the best she could hope for. "I'd like that," she said, settling into the chair. The simple act of sitting in a comfortable piece of furniture, in a room where she didn't need to identify escape routes or scan for threats, felt surreal after so long. Harrison poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine that sat on a sidebar, adding cream to his own and leaving Sarah's black. He remembered her preferences from their briefings 3 years ago. "So," he said, settling back behind his desk, "how much did you hear about why we brought you back?" "Enough," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The arms dealer in Montenegro. The connection to the Naval Intelligence League. The fact that someone inside the Pentagon has been selling submarine patrol schedules to foreign governments. What I don't understand is why you need me. This sounds like an FBI counterintelligence operation, not a SEAL mission. Harrison nodded slowly. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right. But these aren't normal circumstances. The leak is coming from someone with access to the highest levels of naval operations, someone who knows our protocols, our personnel, our security measures, someone who's been very careful to cover their tracks. Inside job, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Worse than that, we think it's someone in the Joint Chiefs Circle, someone who has access to information that could compromise every submarine operation we have planned for the next 5 years. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Pentagon's air conditioning. Submarine patrol schedules weren't just military intelligence, they were the backbone of America's nuclear deterrence strategy. If a foreign power knew where US submarines would be patrolling, they could effectively neutralize the country's ability to respond to a nuclear attack. How long has this been going on? She asked. We first noticed anomalies 18 months ago. Ships being tracked too precisely, patrol routes being compromised, operational security breaches that shouldn't have been possible. But it took us until 6 weeks ago to confirm that the information was being sold rather than just intercepted. Harrison pulled a file from his drawer and slid it across the desk. The cover was marked with classification levels so high that Sarah had only seen them a handful of times in her career. The Montenegro connection came to light when one of our assets in European arms-dealing networks identified the buyer, a shell company with ties to both Russian and Chinese intelligence services. They had been purchasing American naval intelligence for almost 2 years now, paying premium prices for information about submarine movements. Sarah opened the file and began scanning the documents inside. Financial records, communication intercepts, surveillance photos, all painting the picture of a sophisticated espionage operation that had penetrated the highest levels of American military command. You want me to identify the leak, she said, looking up from the papers. More than that, we want you to eliminate it. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah had killed before enemy combatants, terrorists, assassins who had threatened American interests around the world. But this would be different. This would be killing a fellow American. Someone who had taken the same oath she had. Someone who had betrayed that oath for money. Are you certain it's treason? She asked carefully. Not blackmail, not coercion. Harrison's expression hardened. The financial records show payments totaling over $3 million. This isn't someone being forced to cooperate. This is someone who chose to sell out their country for profit. Sarah closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The mission was clear enough, but the logistics would be complicated. She couldn't exactly walk into the Pentagon and start interrogating admirals. How am I supposed to investigate without exposing the fact that I'm alive? She asked. That's where things get complicated, Harrison admitted. About an hour ago, I got a call from Admiral Blackwood. Apparently, he had an encounter this morning with a young woman who demonstrated some rather impressive combat skills. He's ordered a full investigation to determine who she was and how she gained access to restricted areas. Sarah felt her stomach drop. He's investigating me? He's investigating someone who matches your description perfectly, someone who clearly has military training, knows classified information, and isn't intimidated by flag-rank officers. Harrison's tone was carefully neutral. Would you like to explain what happened? Sarah ran a hand through her hair, a gesture that Harrison remembered from their pre-mission briefings 3 years ago. It meant she was calculating options and didn't like any of them. He was about to strike me, she said finally. I stopped him. Maybe I used a little more force than necessary. A little more force, Harrison repeated. According to the witness reports I've been receiving, you immobilized a 6'2" Admiral with one hand while demonstrating enough restraint to avoid actually hurting him. That's not standard civilian behavior, Sarah. I know. It was a mistake. Perhaps. But it might also be an opportunity. Harrison pulled another file from his desk. Blackwood's investigation is going to lead him into classified territory very quickly. When it does, I can have those files redirected to my desk. That gives us cover for you to be present during the investigation. Sarah frowned. How? How? You're going to be my special consultant on the case. Officially, you are Dr. Sarah Martinez, a behavioral analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency with expertise in identifying insider threats. Your credentials will be unimpeachable, your clearance will be legitimate, and your access will be comprehensive. It was elegant, Sarah had to admit. Using Blackwood's own investigation as cover for her mission was the kind of misdirection that had kept her alive for 3 years. What about my appearance? He'll recognize me. That's the beauty of it. He thinks you're a civilian intruder. The last thing he'll expect is for you to walk back into the Pentagon with a government badge and full authority to investigate his own people. Sarah considered the plan. It had risks. If Blackwood connected Dr. Beek Martinez to the woman from the corridor, the entire operation would be compromised. But it also provided her with legitimate access to the people and information she would need to identify the leak. "When do I start?" she asked. "This afternoon." Blackwood has called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss security protocols. You'll be there as my representative, ostensibly to assess whether the morning's incident represents a broader security vulnerability. Harrison stood and walked to his safe, extracting a leather credential case and a stack of documents. Martinez's complete background is in here. PhD in psychology from Georgetown, specialization in organizational behavior and security risk assessment. 10 years with DIA, currently on assignment to the Joint Chiefs for Counterintelligence Operations. Sarah accepted the credentials and began memorizing the details. Creating and maintaining false identities had become second nature during her time in the field, but this was the first time she had needed to become someone who could operate openly within the Pentagon itself. "What's my cover story for knowing about Admiral Blackwood's personal information?" she asked. "Standard background check. As part of your assessment of the security breach, you were provided with detailed files on all personnel who might have been compromised. Your knowledge of his family and career demonstrates thoroughness, not suspicious intelligence gathering." It was a good story. But Sarah could see the potential pitfalls. If Blackwood realizes I'm the same woman, this entire operation falls apart. That's a risk we'll have to take. But consider the alternative. If we don't identify the leak soon, the next submarine patrol schedule that gets sold might compromise operations that cost American lives. Sarah nodded slowly. The mission parameters were clear, even if the execution would be challenging. She had operated under false identities in hostile territory. Doing so in the Pentagon should be manageable. "There's one more thing," Harrison said quietly. "The investigation team will include Colonel Stevens, Blackwood's aide. He was present during your encounter this morning. If anyone is likely to recognize you, it'll be him." Sarah felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the pre-mission tension that came with knowing the stakes were higher than they appeared. "Any suggestions?" "Be Dr. Martinez completely, not just the credentials and the background, but the personality. Blackwood will be looking for signs that you're the woman from the corridor. Give him a completely different person to evaluate." Harrison walked back to his desk and pulled out a small device that looked like a smartphone but was clearly something more sophisticated. "Encrypted communicator, text only, auto-deletes after reading. If you need immediate extraction, or if the mission is compromised, send code word, Lighthouse. I'll have a team ready to pull you out within 30 minutes. Sarah pocketed the device, feeling its weight as a reminder of how dangerous this assignment could become. She had operated solo for 3 years, but always with the knowledge that she was expendable. This mission was different. If she was captured or killed, it would expose not just her own survival, but the entire program that had kept her operational. "One last question," she said, standing to leave. "If I identify the leak, what are the rules of engagement?" Harrison's expression grew somber. "Officially? Gather evidence for prosecution through normal legal channels. Unofficially?" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "You're a ghost, Sarah. Ghosts don't leave witnesses to compromise future operations." The meaning was clear. If the traitor posed a risk to ongoing missions or to Sarah's own cover, elimination was authorized. It was the kind of gray area decision that had defined her work for 3 years. "Understood," she said simply. As Sarah reached the door, Harrison called out one final time. "Sarah? It's good to have you back, even if we can never officially acknowledge what you've done for this country." She paused with her hand on the door handle. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Then she was gone, leaving Harrison alone with his coffee and the weight of sending one of the military's most valuable assets back into danger. As he watched her walk down the corridor through his office window, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would test not just her skills, but her very identity. Dr. Sarah Martinez was about to meet Admiral Blackwood for the first time, and neither of them could know that their confrontation would ultimately expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American naval command. The Pentagon's Conference Room 3A had witnessed countless briefings over the decades, but few as tense as the one that began at 3 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon. Admiral Blackwood sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his jaw still tight with residual anger from the morning's humiliation. Around the table sat his senior staff, Colonel Stevens, Captain Rodriguez from Naval Intelligence, Commander Walsh from Security Operations, and Lieutenant Colonel Thompson from Personnel. At precisely 3 o'clock, Admiral Harrison, entered the room accompanied by a woman none of them had seen before. Dr. Sarah Martinez walked into the conference room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to high-level briefings. She wore a charcoal grey business suit with sensible heels, her dark hair pulled back in a professional chignon. Wire-rimmed glasses gave her a scholarly appearance, and she carried a leather briefcase that suggested she had come prepared for serious work. To Admiral Blackwood, she looked like exactly what she claimed to be, a government analyst brought in to assess security vulnerabilities. Nothing about Dr. Tu. Martinez reminded him of the defiant civilian who had humiliated him that morning. "Gentlemen," Admiral Harrison said as he took a seat, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Philp." Sarah Martinez from the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Doctor?
Martinez specializes in organizational security and insider threat assessment. Given this morning's security incident, I've asked her to conduct a comprehensive review of our current protocols. Sarah nodded politely to the assembled officers, her demeanor professional but unremarkable. "Thank you for accommodating this meeting on such short notice," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Hispanic heritage, a detail from Dr. Martinez's constructed background. "I understand there was a security breach this morning that requires immediate attention." Blackwood leaned forward, his authority reasserting itself now that he was on familiar ground. "Dr. Martinez, what we experienced wasn't just a security breach. It was a direct challenge to military authority by an individual with suspicious knowledge and training." "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Sarah asked, pulling out a notebook and pen. The gesture was so naturally academic that Colonel Stevens, who had been studying her face carefully, began to relax. For the next 20 minutes, Blackwood recounted the morning's events with the kind of detail that comes from wounded pride. He described the woman's appearance, her apparent knowledge of classified information, her complete lack of deference to his rank, and most importantly, the way she had physically restrained him. The combat technique she used, Blackwood emphasized, was clearly military in origin. This wasn't some civilian who got lucky. This was someone with advanced training. Sarah made careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her expertise in security analysis. "Admiral, you mentioned she knew personal details about your family. Can you be more specific about what information she had?" "She knew about my children, my wife's name, my complete service record, information that should only be available to someone with high-level security clearance, or someone with access to publicly available records and basic research skills," Sarah suggested gently. "In my experience, individuals seeking to intimidate authority figures often prepare by gathering easily obtainable personal information. It creates the impression of insider knowledge while requiring no actual security breach." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a common tactic in social engineering attacks. Make the target think you know more than you actually do." Blackwood's face darkened. "Are you suggesting I was fooled by some kind of con artist?" "I'm suggesting we explore all possibilities," Sarah replied calmly. "Colonel Stevens, you were present during the incident. What was your impression of the individual's demeanor?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. She was controlled, professional. Even when the Admiral became angry, she never raised her voice or showed any emotional response. It was like she was assessing the situation tactically. Interesting. That kind of emotional control under stress is consistent with either advanced military training or extensive experience in high-conflict situations. Did she make any statements that suggested knowledge of ongoing operations or current intelligence? "I confiscate the jewel indeed in the right deal." The jewel indeed. When I pressed her on it, she refused to elaborate. Sarah made another note. A vague claim to classification could be an intimidation tactic, or it could be legitimate. Did she make any specific references to operations personnel or intelligence that couldn't be explained by research or educated guessing? The question was carefully designed to probe whether Sarah had revealed anything during the confrontation that would compromise her mission. As the officers discussed the incident, she began to build a psychological profile, not of the mysterious intruder, but of the men around the table. Colonel Stevens was clearly loyal to Blackwood, but possessed enough intelligence to question orders that seemed unreasonable. Captain Rodriguez showed signs of analytical thinking and healthy skepticism. Commander Walsh appeared focused on practical security concerns rather than personal grudges. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had barely spoken during the briefing, but Sarah noticed him checking his phone repeatedly and making small notes that had nothing to do with the discussion at hand. His behavior suggested distraction or anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Dr. Martinez," Admiral Harrison said after the initial briefing was complete, "what's your preliminary assessment of the security implications?" Sarah looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. "Based on what I've heard, I see three possibilities. First, we're dealing with a foreign intelligence operative conducting reconnaissance. Second, we have a domestic threat, someone with legitimate grievances against military authority acting out through provocation. Third, and most concerning, we might be looking at someone with inside knowledge of Pentagon operations. Side knowledge? Blackwood demanded. What makes you think that? Her confidence, primarily. According to your description, she showed no fear when confronted by a flag-rank officer in the heart of the Pentagon. That level of composure suggests either exceptional training or familiarity with the environment. Someone who belonged there, or at least believed they had a right to be there. Sarah paused, watching the faces around the table. I'd like to conduct individual interviews with each of you, as well as anyone else who might have observed the incident. Sometimes details emerge in private conversation that don't surface in group discussions. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah conducted careful interviews with each member of Blackwood's staff. She asked detailed questions about the morning's incident, but more importantly, she probed their knowledge of naval operations, their access to classified information, and their financial circumstances. Colonel Stevens proved to be exactly what he appeared, a competent staff officer with no signs of disloyalty or financial distress. Captain Rodriguez was passionate about his work and showed no indicators of divided loyalty. Commander Walsh was straightforward and professional, focused on practical security measures. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was different. When Sarah interviewed him privately in a smaller conference room, she noticed several concerning details. His hand shook slightly when he thought she wasn't watching. He answered questions about naval operations with more specificity than necessary, volunteering information about submarine patrol schedules that wasn't relevant to the discussion. Most tellingly, he seemed more interested in what she might discover than in helping her discover it. Lieutenant Colonel, Sarah said during their interview, you've been unusually quiet today. Do you have any thoughts about this morning's incident that you haven't shared? Thompson shifted in his chair. I just think we might be making too much of this. Security breaches happen. Maybe we should focus on preventing future incidents rather than hunting for some mysterious intruder. That's an interesting perspective. Do you think Admiral Blackwood is overreacting? The Admiral takes these things personally, Thompson said, then seemed to catch himself. Not that there's anything wrong with that. He's protective of Pentagon security. Sarah made a note, then looked up with what appeared to be casual curiosity. In your opinion, what kind of information would someone need to move freely through restricted areas of the Pentagon? They'd need to know the layout, the patrol schedules, the security protocols. Thompson's answer came quickly, as if he had considered the question before. They'd need access to current operation schedules to avoid high-security areas during sensitive briefings.
Operation schedules, Sarah repeated. Like submarine patrol briefings? Thompson went pale.
I didn't say anything about submarines. You're right, you didn't. But you did mention operation schedules, and given that this incident occurred near the Naval Intelligence Section, submarine operations would be a natural concern. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression remaining professionally neutral while internally she felt the familiar rush of a hunt coming to its conclusion.
Lieutenant Colonel, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer honestly.
Have you ever provided information about naval operations to anyone outside authorized channels? The silence stretched between them. Thompson's face had gone from pale to grey, and small beads of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the conference room's air conditioning. I don't know what you're suggesting, he said finally. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking a straightforward question about your handling of classified information. Thompson stood abruptly. I think this interview is over. If you have accusations to make, you can make them through proper channels with my attorney present. Sarah remained seated, watching him with the kind of calm attention that made his nervousness more pronounced. Lieutenant Colonel, sitting down would be in your best interest right now. Something in her voice, a subtle shift from professional courtesy to quiet authority, made Thompson freeze halfway to the door. For just a moment, he wasn't looking at Dr. Martinez, the analyst. He was looking at someone much more dangerous. Who are you? He whispered. Sarah stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. Someone who's been tracking your financial records for the past 3 weeks. Someone who knows about your contacts in Montenegro. Someone who's very interested in your recent deposits totaling $847,000 from shell companies with ties to foreign intelligence services. Thompson's legs gave out, and he collapsed back into his chair. You can't prove anything. I don't have to prove anything in a courtroom, Lieutenant Colonel. I just have to be certain. Sarah moved around the table, not approaching him but positioning herself between him and the door. Tell me about the submarine patrol schedules you've been selling. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thompson's shoulders sagged as the weight of his exposure finally settled on him. "It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "They told me it was just for tracking exercises, for improving their own submarine detection capabilities." "They?" "Russian naval intelligence. They approached me 18 months ago when I was having financial problems. My daughter needed surgery, experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. They offered to help." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle over her. She had heard similar justifications from targets around the world, good people who had made terrible choices for understandable reasons. It didn't make them less dangerous. "How much information have you provided? Patrol schedules for the Atlantic Fleet, some Pacific operations? Nothing about strategic deterrent patrols, I swear. I drew the line at anything involving nuclear submarines." "That's not your decision to make," Sarah said quietly. "Any information about American naval operations could compromise ongoing missions and endanger American lives." Thompson looked up at her with desperation in his eyes. "I can fix this. I can be a double agent, feed them false information. I can help you catch the people who recruited me." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception. She found only fear and a desperate hope for redemption. In another time, under different circumstances, it might have been enough. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson," she said formally, "you're under arrest for treason against the United States of America." But as she reached for her encrypted communicator to call for backup, Thompson made one final, desperate decision. His hand shot toward the service weapon on his belt. Not to attack Sarah, but to turn it on himself. Sarah moved with the fluid grace that had kept her alive through 3 years in hostile territory. Her hand intercepted his wrist while her other arm swept his legs, dropping him to the floor in a controlled takedown that left him conscious but immobilized. "I don't think so," she said quietly, removing his weapon and securing it. "You're going to face the consequences of your choices, not take the easy way out." As she knelt beside the subdued traitor, Sarah activated her communicator. "Lighthouse protocol is not required. Package is secured and ready for pickup." The response came back immediately. "Extraction team en route." "Well done, Ghost." Ghost. Her real call sign, spoken aloud for the first time in 3 years. As she waited for Admiral Harrison's security team to arrive, Sarah allowed herself a moment to consider what came next. The mission was complete, the leak had been identified and contained, but her existence was no longer a secret. Admiral Blackwood would demand answers about Dr. Martinez's true identity. Colonel Stevens would want to know how a dire analyst had military-grade combat skills. The investigation that had begun with a moment of wounded pride would ultimately expose the existence of a program so classified that even most Pentagon officials didn't know it existed. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today she had done what she had been trained to do, protect American interests by any means necessary, even if it meant stepping out of the shadows that had hidden her for 3 years. When Admiral Harrison's security team arrived to take Thompson into custody, they found Dr. Martinez calmly filling out an incident report, her professional demeanor intact despite having just apprehended a traitor. To all appearances, she was simply a competent government analyst who had successfully identified an insider threat. Only Admiral Harrison would know that the woman writing the report was Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell, officially dead for 3 years, unofficially, one of the most successful covert operatives in American military history. And only Sarah would know that this mission, her last mission, had finally brought her home. The Ghost had returned to the world of the living, and the Pentagon would never be quite the same.